At the age of 90, former Chinese Vice Premier Qichen has died. Chen played a vital role in the founding and initial development of the People's Republic of China and in its subsequent diplomacy. What are his major contributions? Pursuing peace and making friends was the principle proposed by Chen, which helped China to establish important relationships with countries throughout the world, especially when the PRC had just been founded. What experiences in his diplomatic career can be applied today? In the negotiations for the return of Hong Kong and Macau, Chen played a crucial role. What lessons could be drawn from those historic moments? Chen served as a member of the Political Bureau of the CPC Central Committee, Minister of Foreign Affairs, and Vice Premier of the State Council. What are the highlights of his career and his most important legacies?
Former Vice Premier Chen, who was China's foreign minister for a decade, died last Tuesday in Beijing. His funeral was held today. His calm character saw him through many crises, and he was trusted by generations of Chinese leaders. He was also the first Chinese diplomat to publish a book, 10 episodes in China's diplomacy, relating behind-the-scenes stories from his own perspective. To discuss the life of Chen, I'm pleased to be joined in the studio by Hua Liming, former Chinese ambassador to Iran, Su Ge, director of the China Institute of International Studies, and Professor Jimmy Cruz from the Peking University. He's also former bureau chief of CNN. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Yang Rui. Welcome to our discussion here, which is meant to pay tribute to Mr. Chen, a renowned senior diplomat of the People's Republic of China. Now, why do you think he's so popular with not only diplomats, professional diplomats in China, but also with those who are familiar with the period of Chinese diplomacy when he engineered the transformation of China's diplomacy from the Cold War to the post-Cold War era? I'd like to have your comments.
Because he was the chief of diplomacy of China during 90s, the most difficult time of Chinese foreign policy and diplomacy. Remember, after 1989, China was sanctioned and was pressed by the West countries led by the United States. And China had very difficult times. And fortunately, he was my boss and teacher as well when I was working in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs as the chief of the Middle East Department. So I had personal experience to be the very good friend and to be led by his foreign policy. So we all remember him when China had experienced the most difficult time in diplomacy. He was the Minister of Foreign Affairs, and he was the chief of the China's diplomacy. And in many tough times, many difficult times, he has experienced. So that's why today we all have deeply respect to him.
Mr. Su Ge, what do you think of his influence?
His influence?
And his image?
I think as Ambassador Hua said that he was the chief, he was the of diplomat, and he was probably the most senior and of Chinese diplomats. And because he held this very high position, and at the same time he was also very down to the close to the people and to the common and ordinary diplomats, and that because of his important position, he performed the role of linkage between the top policymakers and the practitioners. It's a kind of, he translated the top decisions from the very top into actual foreign policies and the diplomatic tactics. Indeed, those 10 years were probably the most difficult times of diplomacy of New China, from 88 through 98. A lot of things were happening, but he was able to carry out the behalf of the Central Party Committee, so that during those years, from the late years of the 80s, China-U.S. relations was restored, and then China-Russian relations, and China also established diplomatic relations with Korea, with Singapore, and with South Arabia, just to say, to mention a few of them. So those were the years which performed very formative role for today's diplomacy. So that's why people remember him as a staunch, like a fighter, like a good teacher, and also one of the very loyal son of the People's Republic.
Jimmy, you were one of the most influential Western correspondents based in Beijing, and your job, I'm afraid, is to document history. You witnessed some of the chapters that Mr. Chen Qichen went through as the top diplomat in my country. What do you think of his performance?
Yeah, I was fortunate to witness him in action up close. I remember him as an elegant and eloquent diplomat, kind of the old classical Chinese diplomat, who was not imposing physically and talked actually quite, he was a soft-spoken person, but there was force in the way he conducted himself, in the way he spoke. It's kind of, I'm reminded of a Chinese saying, 不卑不亢, right? He was neither haughty or arrogant, nor self-defeating or someone with inferior complex. I think that exemplifies the style of the Chinese diplomat of his era. And if we all read the recent Chinese history, China's diplomatic history, Chen Qichen's name will be there in every chapter that we can write about.
Maybe Mr. Chen Qichen is typically a product of the Confucianism. 儒雅 is the catchphrase. 儒 means Confucianism, 雅 means elegance. Right? If you put these words together to form an image, conjure up an image, that's how we look at Mr. Chen Qichen. He has a very strong background as a Russian major. His diplomatic career actually started from the Chinese embassy in Moscow. He witnessed the honeymoon years between China and the former Soviet Union. To what degree do you think this has helped him to negotiate a solution to the border disputes between the former Soviet Union, or Russia, and China?
I remember his ideas. That's really big lessons for me when I was Director General of the Middle East Department, Minister of Foreign Affairs. He was telling us, as Minister of Foreign Affairs, Chinese diplomacy is to bridge China and outside world, and to make the outside world friendly to China, and to create a peaceful and a very friendly international atmosphere for China, so China can focus all its energies on economy.
Are you suggesting that China was weak in the early days of a modernization drive, and we badly needed peaceful external surrounding so that we can concentrate on the domestic rebuilding after 1 decade of chaos, the Cultural Revolution?
That may be the characteristics of his period, but I think not limited to that period. Even if China is stronger than yesterday, or even if China will be more stronger than today, I think his ideas will work to make peace, to bridge China with the outside world, and not to be elegant.
What you say actually reminds me of media debates on the image of Wu Jianmin, late diplomat, ambassador to France, and Hu Jintao, editor-in-chief of Global Times. Wu Jianmin is labeled as dove and Hu Xijin a hawk. You emphasize overwhelmingly the importance of peacemaking to serve domestic economic rebuilding. Is that the most important mandate of a diplomat for China now and in the future?
Just now you noted two very well-known figures in China's press and then China's diplomacy, Wu Jianmin and Hu Xijin. Actually, my personal opinion is that now the People's Republic, the diplomacy is made by the Party Central Committee. The Foreign Service actually is the group of people who carry out the set of policies. And my personal opinion is that there are no doves or hawks. Some people may be from a diplomatic background. Some people may be from a military background. It's just like the different categories or different undertakings. They all serve in their respective perspectives in the service of to defend national interests.
But I'm afraid Jimmy would disagree. If you have followed public debates on the new media, opinions are seriously divided across the spectrum. Do you really believe that we have only one single voice representing peacemaking image?
I think it's natural to have many voices. I mean, in fact, China doesn't want Yentang, right? Just one single voice in one room. And like many other countries, you too here have different voices. Of course, you know, some are diplomats and some are opinion makers, so they're not really the same. And it's okay. I think it's natural and perhaps should be allowed, if not encouraged, that different voices get heard on different platforms. I think what is different about the late Foreign Minister Chen is that I don't remember him raising his voice or wagging his finger. And yet, I think under his leadership, China was able to assert its national interest in the world. So I don't think a successful diplomat can necessarily be based on the way they wagged their finger or they shouted China's position. There is force in being low-key. And the saying is, you carry a big stick and you speak softly. That's the image of a big power. That's big power diplomacy.
Unlike the DPRK, relying on nuclear tests and missile tests. Now, he is the author of 10 episodes in China's diplomacy. Which one is most impressive for you?
Really, his book is very impressive. Just recorded all the diplomacy China experienced from 1999 to from 1989 to 1999, the 10 years, most difficult times. But the first thing I remember was his contribution to the improvement of relation between China and the former Soviet Union. When he was not minister yet, he was a deputy minister. And he was a very chief negotiator of Chinese side with the former Soviet Union. And the relation was very bad. And 1 million Soviet troops were stationed in the border between China and the Soviet Union. So that was Deng Xiaoping's thinking that when we start the reforms and open the door to the outside, if we don't have a peaceful environment, especially our northern border is not peaceful, we cannot focus our things inside China. So Chen Qichen was asked to be the chief negotiator with the Soviet Union, and he was a very successful negotiator. That impressed Deng Xiaoping very much. I think that was his first contribution to Chinese foreign policy before he became Minister of Foreign Affairs. Of course, during the 10 years, he did a lot of things as he wrote in his book.
Yes, indeed, he did. He must have done a lot to lay groundwork for a thaw in the relationship between former Soviet Union and China, and that culminated with a visit by Gorbachev to Beijing in 1989, when we unfortunately had a chaos in Tiananmen Square, a tragedy, of course, for this country. What do you think of what he wrote in the book?
Well, there's so many things that he wrote. The 10 episodes are only some of the many accomplishments Minister Qichen made. I think even one episode is that before he became even the Minister of Foreign Affairs, and he was in charge of the press section. And because he was loyal to the country and he had such a shrewd perspectives into things, and for instance, when the Taiwan issue is taken into consideration, and he felt that, well, some people in the United States may
by the way, liberation of Taiwan was said to be one of the 3 major tasks during the Deng Xiaoping times, right?
Yeah.
解放台湾3大任务之一.
Yeah,
yes.
and actually, he put up a paper saying that some people in the United States may think that China now needs the United States more than the United States does China, because China wanted to had such bad relationship with the Soviet Union, and the United States could do something, could sell more weaponry to Taiwan. And he wrote a paper, and Deng Xiaoping put just 2 words: no way. And then that led to the whole negotiation with the United States for the August 17th communique limiting U.S. arms sales to Taiwan. And another thing is that because he is loyal, so loyal to the country, he defended the country's interests with all he can. And he's so shrewd in seeing things, even right at the very beginning. And I just now, Mr. Ambassador Hua and we were talking about the fact that when Gorbachev was making some remarks in Tashkent about China, and then Chen later made remarks with 3 sentences. The first one: we have taken note of what Gorbachev, Brezhnev has to say. The second is that we are opposed to what he said, the negative things he said about China. Then he said, as for the future of China-Soviet relations, we pay more attention to what the Soviet does than their words. So these just paved the way for the establishment of a foreign ministry spokesman. So I think that and also just now Ambassador Hua also said that those low tide years, and since the latter half of the 1980s, he faithfully carried out Deng Xiaoping's decisions. So Chinese diplomacy had played a low profile, and then just stick to the principles while exercised flexibility. So those were the most difficult years, but Chen did a tremendous job.
Thank you so much. You are watching Dialogue with Ambassador Hua Liming, Mr. Su Ge, and Jimmy, former CNN bureau chief. We are here to review the diplomatic career of Mr. Qichen, who died a couple of days ago, and why his legacy is so important in shaping China's diplomatic strategy in the most difficult years since the end of the Cold War and the end of the Cultural Revolution. We'll be back in a short while. Stay with us, please. Welcome back, Jimmy. Ambassador Hua and Mr. Su both mentioned the press briefing, the first of its kind since the founding of the PRC, and that took place in 1983,
right?
Before the end of the Cold War.
Yes.
You were there.
I was there.
As far as I'm concerned, you were there. So what did you see? How
well,
did you feel?
Now press conference is not a big deal, right? But at that time, that was a big deal. It's like, really, they want a press conference? And he was there. He was the one who presided it. You know, it was brief. He didn't really take any questions, but it was a breakthrough of sorts. As the spokesman of the foreign ministry, subsequently it became a pattern once a month, and then it became twice a month, and then it became weekly, and later became daily, Monday to Friday. I also credit him for encouraging press conferences at the end of the National People's Congress. It was under his rule when the Chinese Prime Minister and other ministers faced the media, Chinese and foreign media, every year, and to answer questions. So I believe that it opened China's window to the world, but also it opened the windows of Chinese officials that there's actually a virtue in communicating directly with the media. And now, again, it's no longer a big deal that Chinese officials face the media. So it's credit to Foreign Minister Chen.
So in other words, China is in the correct direction, step by step, to promote transparency about the decision-making in facing the media and fielding their questions. Here is yet another point that may have confused some of the overseas observers about the image of Chen Qichen. Now, as usual, after he died, he was praised like an excellent Communist Party member, a time-tested and a loyal communist soldier, a proletarian revolutionist, and an outstanding diplomat. These words and the wording like this immediately takes us back to the old period before the end of the Cultural Revolution. With the end of the Cultural Revolution, I'm afraid one of the hallmarks in navigating China's new diplomacy, I'm afraid, is to depoliticize, to minimize the ideological impact in shaping China's national security. Yet, when we review his diplomacy and the image of this man, the top diplomat, such words are used. And what do you think of the alleged confusion concerning, the way he's described and portrayed?
I think his official obituary is a template for communist leaders and Chinese officials like him. It's obligatory, coming from the official media, for example. So I think real articles or stories about how good he was as a diplomat will come much later. It will be written by his protégés like Mr. Su and Mr. Hua. It will be written by students of Chinese diplomacy and Chinese politics, international politics as well.
Is it correct that such an article or commentary on the image of Chen Qichen and his influence aims to serve two groups of audiences? One is domestic, the other international. In fact, this first of all targets the domestic audience.
Yes.
Instead of facing the international viewers or readers who would focus more on the external influence of China's diplomacy. Do you think this holds any water?
Actually, he was a communist.
Of course.
When he secretly joined the Communist Party when he was 14 in Shanghai.
He was 14.
Yes.
Relatively a teenager.
Yes.
Right.
Yes. I remember, fortunately, in the middle school, I was studying. He was actually the Communist Party leader of this area I was studying there. So he was a communist. I think that's right to say he was a communist. As well as when we say late Premier Zhou Enlai was a communist, late Marshal Chen Yi was a communist. But at the same time, they are all prominent diplomats. I think there's no difference between them.
But Bush Sr. said to Chen Qichen,
yes,
if you could remove the name of your party, then the image of China would have been a lot better with the end of the Cold War. Do you think China's diplomacy is very much driven by our ideology since the end of the Cold War? What do you think of the legacy of our ideology, the influence of it, and the way China is perceived?
I think personally, there's an evolution in Chinese diplomacy. It used to be steeped in ideology and driven by ideology, but now China has risen into a big power, and I think China's diplomacy is now driven by many other factors, including ideology, but also national interest, maritime interest, economic interest, and people-to-people relations. It's probably a natural evolution. of course, it's still led by the Communist Party, and it's still driven by the committee that is in charge of the foreign affairs in the Communist Party.
During his years as the foreign minister and later on vice premier, member of the Politburo, never before have Chinese diplomats received such a great political honor and treatment. And yet he was really facing some of the most enduring and adverse challenges, such as the handover of Hong Kong back in 1997 and handover of Macau. He was the top diplomat. Could you imagine the difficulties he was facing?
Really, that was a very difficult years. Only the return of the sovereignty of Hong Kong to China, the Chinese government. I remember the joint communique between China and the UK was signed in 1984 after negotiations. But after 1991, when the former Soviet Union collapsed, the UK returned all of the conditions. So the transitions of authority of the Hong Kong government to Chinese central government became very difficult. It was a very difficult time for Chinese government, and the negotiations between China and John Major, and that time Prime Minister of Britain, was very difficult. Another example was that you may remember that in 1993, China applied for Olympic Games for the millennium 2000 in Sydney.
We applied.
Yes,
we
applied. We applied. But joint efforts had made by the Western countries, of course led by the United States, made China failed. China couldn't make the application. So that's all were the setbacks of Chinese diplomacy. But he resisted all these things with very calm position and with very calm. The third example I will tell you is that the first Gulf War, when China was freshly sanctioned by the Western countries, all the visits on the revisits, exchange of visits between China and the United States was banned. And I think I remember the state secretary of that time of the United States was James Baker. He needed China's help, assistance for the first Gulf War, but because the meeting between Chinese foreign minister and the U.S. foreign minister was banned. How can that do? So Chen made a very good.
Thank you so much. Well, obviously we need to have more time to review the excellence and brilliance of Mr. Chen Qicheng's diplomatic career. He is said to be the top advisor to Mr. Jiang Zemin in shaping China's foreign policy. Well, see you next time. Goodbye.